I pulled up in front of the shop and had to recheck my directions. It was a dingy little hole-in-the-wall place between a Dollar General and a computer repair shop. It looked like it had just existed here since the creation of the first VHS tape. The windows were covered in thick yellow paper, and the outside was caked with a film of old dirt. The sign on the door read "Open," but it was barely visible through the dirty windows. There was no way this place was what I wanted. When I was a kid, I remember watching a show called Children of Man. As a kid, the premise of the show appealed to me. The show was all about kids living on an island in the Pacific, trying to survive day-to-day trials. The producers had gotten about 40 kids from all over America, ages 10 to 12, and dropped them off with supplies and instructions on how to survive. The host, Chris Mansworth, was a survival expert, and he would create challenges every day for the kids to complete. There were 4 teams of 10 kids, and the winner of each challenge got something cool for their area of the village. I watched the show religiously as a kid. Every Saturday night, right after The Simpsons, the show would come on, and I would be enthralled. I always imagined that I was on the island with them, surviving day to day. The challenges were really neat, too. They had kids gut and clean their own meat, dig wells by hand, build rafts for raft races, and make aqueducts so their village could have running water. It was a neat idea, but after 8 episodes, the show just kind of stopped. No new episodes came out, and the station never gave a reason. This was before the internet, so there was no way to check on updates online. So the show slipped off into obscurity, and my 10-year-old self just kind of forgot about it. I remembered the show again a few years ago, when Mom sent me a box of stuff from the attic. There were a couple of old VHS tapes in there, and between Batman, the animated series, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, were 8 tapes with handwritten labels that read Children of Men. We had a VHS recorder when I was a kid, and I can remember recording my favorite shows to watch later. I was excited to get to see the old show again, the memories flooding back as I started looking for the VHS player amongst the tapes in the box. There wasn't one, but a quick trip to Goodwill and $15, and I had a gently used VCR hooked up to my TV. I watched all 8 episodes back to back and fell in love with the show all over again. I remembered the kids I liked. Robert and Catherine were my favorites, but many of the kids had also been given a lot of screen time, and it was hard not to like them too. As I watched, I found myself wanting to see how the show ended over and over again. As I watched the show, I began to notice something a little darker under the surface too, something I hadn't noticed as a kid. The village was divided into 4 teams: green snakes, bluebirds, red foxes, and brown mice. The teams had been divided up by background mostly, and it seemed very divisive to me as an adult. The green snakes did most of the hunting for the village, a lot of their kids having a rural background, while the brown mice did most of the farming and gathering because they came from a farm background. The red foxes were in charge of construction and upkeep. They were the smart kids, and they worked with the bluebirds who were in charge of food management and cooking the meals. Every team had a representative who sat on a council. Robert was for the green snakes, Catherine for the bluebirds, Marco for the red foxes, and Shireen for the brown mice. As the show went on, it became very apparent that Robert didn't trust Marco, and with good reason. Marco and Shireen had formed a kind of alliance on their own, most of it because Marco bullied her into doing what he wanted. Robert and Catherine set up their own alliance, and Robert started holding out food to sway Shireen's decision. The village needed food, and Robert pointed out that he and Catherine were the ones providing it. Robert and Shireen wanted a fair split for everyone, but Marco tried to split them into class systems that would put his foxes at a higher tier. Robert didn't like that, and it became very clear that if Chris hadn't been there would have been a lot more fighting. Robert was a big 12-year-old, a stocky bruiser who won battles with his fists most of the time, and Chris had to separate him and Marco on more than one occasion. Marco was smaller, but definitely had charisma. He had most of the mice and all of the foxes on his side, and I wasn't sure how I missed all of this tension as a kid. It all came to a head on episode 6. Marco was caught hoarding food in the Red Fox village. It wasn't just food that the other teams had been bringing in either. He had been taking the comfort foods from the canteen the brown mice ran for the village and storing them in his hut. Robert discovered this and took Marco prisoner, demanding that he be placed on trial. The whole village was in an uproar, but Marco agreed to be confined to a central cabin until the council could rule on his trial. Chris was setting the whole trial up as an episode 8 for the viewers. At the end of episode 8, the council found Marco guilty, and the episode was ended with a lot of shaky camera work and the red foxes storming the podium where Marco was seated. That was how the show had ended. The little bell chimed overhead as I stepped into the tiny place. The store looked like a throwback. Sharp-looking rickety shelves that were covered in plastic VHS boxes and dust. The shelves held VHS tapes, Betamax, and DVD cases that were arranged neatly amongst the filth and dust. A quick look showed that they were all arranged alphabetically, like an ancient library of some sort. The shelves fronted onto a glass display case that held murky wonders within. On the counter was a TV, an ashtray stacked with old butts, and a greasy store clerk who smiled at me as I approached. "You the one who called about the tape?" he asked, showing a mouthful of stained teeth as he smiled. I had searched for months on my own. I had taken to the internet in an attempt to find something, anything that would give me some closure. Wikipedia told me that only 8 episodes were aired, but that 12 had been intended. I dug deeper and began to see that the show was a mystery all its own. The list of children that had been on the show was woefully incomplete. Marco and Robert were there, so were Catherine and Shannon, and Chris was there as the host, but none of the other children were named. No one except Chris Mansworth had gone on to do anything after the show, and his only contribution was his death a few months later. His Wikipedia said that he had committed suicide in his hotel room, and foul play was not suspected. As for the last 4 episodes of Children of Man, however, there was no mention. So I took to the usual online sleuths, Reddit, 4chan, TV message boards, but no one seemed to have the answer. Most people had never even heard of Children of Man, and the ones that had were more interested in my copies than the last 4 episodes. Apparently the episodes were never compiled or released for purchase, and the only means by which you could still see them were on VHS tapes like mine. I had several offers for them. One guy wanted to give me $500 per tape, but I declined and told him I'd post copies of the tapes for free if they wanted. That's how I met Charleston Hammer 462. He was a user on the hometown board of Reddit. He saw my post and the posted videos and got in contact with me about the place I was currently in. Heard you were looking for a certain tape. In my line of work, when you're looking for something, you go talk to Reggie. He owns a shop in Burlington, South Carolina called Video Time Capsule. If you need a banned episode of a 70s drama or a never-aired documentary from the 60s, you talk to Reggie. I read the message a few times before responding. Thanks, Charleston, but these episodes aren't just unaired, they're unknown. No one has ever seen them. I don't even know if they exist. And the store you're talking about is 400 miles away. When I hit send on the message, I figured I'd never hear from him again. It took him an hour to respond, but he got back with me. What you're after is very rare. I used to watch Children of Man myself when I was younger. It ended so abruptly that it's been an internet mystery since the net was just message boards and wells. I didn't learn about the last 4 episodes, though, until I met Reggie at TVCon. We got to talking about old TV shows, and after a few drinks, he told me he had the last 4 episodes of Children of Men. I perked up. Have you seen them? That response took a little longer. I have. It's some pretty different stuff. I won't ruin it for you, but if you value the way you remember the show, don't watch it. There's a reason these episodes never made it to air. Here's the number to the store. If it's late, call him anyway. Reggie keeps weird hours, and sometimes that store's open 24 hours a day. He's an eccentric dude, don't doubt, but he has what you're looking for. The number was at the bottom of the message. Yeah, I said, no longer quite sure what I was doing here. Yeah, I called about the complete series of Children of Men. He nodded, reached under the counter, and slapped a plain white case onto it. All 8 episodes, recorded as aired, he said, studying me. I frowned. I'm after the last 4 episodes. His piggy eyes glinted behind the grease-smeared glasses. There were only 8 episodes aired. And you told me you had the other 4 that never aired. He smiled, and it did ghastly things to his porcine face. Had to make sure. Come to the back. And with that, he disappeared behind the curtain into the back room. I walked around, hesitating for a moment as I touched the curtain, and followed him. I'd come 400 miles, might as well go 5 feet into hell. The phone rang 6 times. I was just about to hang up when someone answered and spoke through a mouthful of food. I didn't understand him, but once he'd swallowed whatever he'd had in his mouth, he tried again. Video Time Capsule, where your memories are always on sale. What a tagline. Yes, I'm looking for something specific. The sound of something being stuffed into the speaker's mouth and chewed loudly assaulted my ears as he continued. Aren't they all? What you looking for? Clearly, customer service was not his strong suit. Episodes 9 through 12 of Children of Man. I heard something hit the floor, and the speaker cursed loudly. Yeah, you must be mistaken. There are only 8 episodes of Children of Man. Look, I said a little hotly, I was told that you have things that no one else does. I want to see those episodes. I don't even want to buy them. I was just told that you have them in your possession. Is there any way that I can just... $500, the voice returned, and the tone was not to be bargained with. In cash, before I will even let you see them. I agreed, despite the outrageous price, and now I was here in the grungy shop, preparing to go into the back. The back was worse than the front. DVDs and VHS tapes were stacked into teetering piles. The back room was lit by only a few dingy overheads, and I could see an old TV casting its glow from the back. The floor was riddled with trash, and I swear you could hear the mice scampering around to get out of my way. What sort of videos could you find in here? Would this place give me anything but heartbreak? This seemed like the setup for 1,000 scary stories, and I suddenly didn't want to see these mysterious artifacts. But like anyone else who comes to find things that they want, I needed to see them. Reggie was waiting by the TV. He had an ancient set that looked very similar to the one my parents had owned. On top of it was a VHS DVD combo player that had a set of rabbit ears stuck out of it like a weather vane. There was a wooden chair in front of it with a little blue pad on it. Reggie held up a hand. $500, he said. I reached into my pocket, but I paused. How do I know it's authentic? Look, I could get into a lot of trouble for even owning this, okay? You think guys who possess child porn go to prison for a long time? This would put me under the prison for life. If you want to see those episodes, then I need the money. Are we doing business or what? I handed him the money, and he popped the cassette tape in and walked away. Not joining me, I asked. Not for another $500, kid. I heard the curtains rustle, and the show began. Episode 9 gave us a recap of the trial, and then the storming of the stage. When the show started, I noticed a distinct lapse in the film quality. Whoever was operating the camera was just shorter than the usual crew members, and they seemed barely able to lift the heavy rig. Finally, the camera had Robert in frame, and he began to fill us in on what was happening in the village. It's been about 3 days since Marco's trial and his escape. Since then, Fox Village has been separated from our village. They took most of the brown mice with them, and now they're trying to raid us every night for food. Something's going on over there. We heard shouts this morning, and... At that point, the shouts got louder, and Robert ran off screen as the camera tried to follow him. We came to the edge of Red Fox Village. Many of the huts that were once on the verge had been burnt out, making a kind of barricade between them and the rest of the village. Many voices were cheering as something swung from the tree. At first, I thought it was just an effigy, a dummy maybe, but then suddenly I realized it was Shireen. She hung like a grotesque wind chime in the space between the villages, and Robert shouted for Marco to stop being a coward and come out. Some of the kids were crying, but everyone on the other side cheered and shouted, "Traitor!" or "Faithless!" at the swinging body of Shireen. I sat glued to the TV, unsure if any of this was even real. It was night when the next recording resumed. It seemed that whoever was running the camera wanted us to see a raid. The night vision on the camera showed kids with torches fighting other kids who were leaving their storehouse in a hurry. The kids with torches hacked at them with machetes, blood flying as they connected, and some of them dropped as they were stabbed or hacked to pieces by the blades of the other children. The rest of the episode was mostly uneventful. Lots of shaky cam, lots of crying, and at one point someone dropped it and didn't pick it up again for several minutes. As the episode ended, I was left looking at my own stark face looking back at me. What had I just watched? There was no way this could be the same show. Things had gone very Lord of the Flies in the village, and as the 10th episode started, I wasn't sure what to expect. Episode 10 started without preamble. There was no recap, no theme music, and the footage looked unedited. We see a much more professional camera crew, and Chris Mansworth trying to bring some order back to the island. They're coming up through the shallows, Chris and about 10 adults, coming up in the dark towards the village. Chris was talking about how it had all gotten so out of hand, and how he was going to try to rescue the kids. As they came into the seemingly empty village, Chris cupped his hands and began to shout at the empty huts. He told them that the game was over, and that it was time they went home. He told them that there was a boat that would take them home. But There was still no response. He moved deeper into the collection of straw huts, the fires burning low around him, and that was when they struck. Kids with spears, kids with machetes, came screaming out of the darkness, and the cameramen backpedaled furiously as the adults were completely taken by surprise. Blood flew, legs were sawed off as pint-sized pygmies, hacked and chopped, and Chris Mansworth was buried under a pile of children as he screamed and flailed. As the cameraman tripped and went down, we see the shadow of a child standing over him as the spear comes down as well. The episode ended very abruptly. I was speechless. What the hell had happened to them? These were kids that had been doing challenges and making friends. The rivalry between Robert and Marco had always been the most serious part of the show, but now they had devolved into savagery. The 11th episode was about 10 minutes long. It opened on a stationary camera shot of the same space where they had held the trial. Marco was on his knees before the camera, and he looked bad. His left eye was a puffy mass of bruised tissue. His left ear was a bleeding stump. His nose looked to be cut jaggedly. He was weeping silently, and his tears were thick and bloody. Robert stood behind him. He had always worn a white football jersey in every episode I'd seen him in, but the garment was stained red and brown now. He bled from several places on his chest, and when he raised his machete, it was with obvious pain. This morning, before the sun had risen, this dog attempted to attack our village. He violated the rules of war as agreed upon by he and I. We agreed to a battle between our two villages at dawn. This snake tried to attack us in the night and lost. Thus his village is forfeit. As the winner, I sentence him to death. Please, Robert, Mansworth said, his voice off screen. The show's over. We can all go home now, back to your parents. It doesn't have to end like this. As Marco cried his terrible tears, Robert looked at Chris off screen and turned back to his enemy. The show is over. This is our home now. He brought the machete down. Marco cried out and fell face first onto the ground. Robert fell on him, hitting him with the machete again and again. Blood sprayed from the struggling child, and when Robert looked back at the camera, his face was spattered with gore. He reached out, and the camera went off abruptly. The last episode was only a few minutes. It started with a shaky cam journey through the jungle. The runner was being pursued. I could hear the footsteps behind him. As the runner got to the shore, he jumped onto something and pushed it into the water. The wooden deck of a boat came into view, and as he drifted out, I could hear oars working in the water. He sat the camera on the seat as he rowed, and the faces of children could be seen in the surrounding jungle. Then, everything went dark. The tape clicked, and the TV went back to static. I left it in the VCR and stumbled out of the back room. Reggie was sitting behind the counter and looked up at me with something like sympathy. He held something back towards me, and I saw it was my money. I shook my head and stepped away from him. I had bought a ticket, and I had paid the price. You okay? Yeah, so what happened to the kids? They just left them there? Reggie shrugged. Coast Guard picked up Mansworth about 2 days later. He was drifting in the ocean and looked extremely rattled. He wouldn't tell them how he had gotten out there or where he had been. When he got back, he gave the tapes to the studio, and the next time anyone saw him, he was dead. And the kids? The studio never pursued the show, never sold the aired episodes. They never even tried to air what Chris had brought back. They just made the whole thing disappear. I suppose there's an island out there full of kids who wanted to be on a TV show and just never came back. Their parents were likely told there had been an accident or something. The whole thing was hushed up and eventually people forgot. You'll forget one day too, he added, as though he thought it might help. As I lay in bed now, trying to forget the horrible things I saw, I hope I do forget, but I doubt I ever will. So if you ever find an island out in the Pacific, maybe one full of locals that look just a little not right, turn your boat back out of sight. Those natives are not friendly. They call it the Martin House, and it's easily the most haunted place in town. During the day, it's a beautiful 2-story estate in the Millville area. It sits behind a high gate overlooking the bay on 10 acres, which comes at a premium given the land's cost inside of Panama City. The current owner keeps up the grounds,
maintains the home, but they say he will not live in the house or be there after night. He rents it out for parties and events, lets people picnic on the grounds, opens it during the day for tours and historic outings. But an hour before sunset, the gates are locked and the place is cleared of people. It's a beautiful place, but they say that the devil walks there after dark. The local legend says that Mr. Martin suspected his wife was having an illicit affair with a servant. They say that in a fit of jealousy, he made her watch as he hung him, later hanging his wife and kids and himself from the same large tree in the front yard. They say you can hear voices, screams, and all kinds of odd noises there after dark. They say people have seen figures in the windows and on the grounds near sunset, with black eyes and pale faces. They say you can see lights come on and off in the house after dark, and it's best avoided once the sun goes down. They say a lot of things, but as a writer of dark fiction, I don't put a lot of stock in local legends. I don't believe in Billy Bowlegs. I don't believe in Kissing Mary. And I don't believe in the hitchhikers they say you can pick up by the West Bay Bridge. The Martin house, however, is something I do believe in, because when I was young, I experienced it firsthand. It was 1993 or 94 when it happened, and I was about 7 or 8. My mother had worked at the same hospital for years, and that hospital had chosen to do their employee appreciation picnic on the grounds of the Martin house. I have to believe they were aware of the dark history of the place, but like I said, nothing ever happened during the day, so they weren't worried. The yard was huge, and the human resource department set up games and tents and all kinds of other things to entertain the kids while their parents socialized. I fell in with a couple of kids that I knew, and we played some games and explored the booths, but ultimately got a little bored with the scheduled events. These were kids that I didn't know well, but we all knew each other in that way that you know someone after spending years upon years going to these sorts of scheduled events with them. One of them was the son of my mom's friend. Another one was a kid I actually went to school with, but didn't really pal around with outside of things like this. Another one was just a kid who would wander up and fall back in with us when we all got together. There were about 7 of us that day, the rest of them just falling in with a group of kids to play games, and I can't remember who suggested that we play hide and seek. It was unanimously agreed upon, but after playing on the lawn for a few rounds, it became a little dull. When someone suggested that we could play in the house, that sounded like a much better idea. So we went inside, but quickly discovered the problem with playing indoors. The house was kind of a museum, and adults didn't really like it when kids were running around things that could be broken. We tried for a couple of rounds, but after being yelled at by a lady in a dress, we thought we might have to go back outside. That was when we saw the kid on the stairs. Like I said, none of us really knew each other, but none of us had ever seen this kid. He was youngish, probably 5 or 6, and he didn't really say anything. He just sort of stared at us through the slats on the staircase, and I'll remember the way he looked at us for my entire life. He seemed both fascinated by our appearance and utterly terrified at our game. He looked at us the way I looked at the dog sometimes, when he was making noise while my dad was trying to nap. He looked like he thought we might wake up a parent that would be angry. Someone suggested that maybe we could go play upstairs, and we all thought that might be a good idea. The upstairs was usually blocked off, but if that kid was up there, then the door must be unlocked. None of us had ever gone upstairs. It was locked, like I said, but we found the door was open, so we all went up. The upstairs was about the same size as the downstairs, but we saw a ladder going up into the attic, and thought that would make the best place for hide and seek. It would be dark up there, probably with stuff to hide behind, and it would be spooky. What we found was a pretty big attic with boxes and furniture covered in sheets. It was dusty and cobwebby and reminded me of the opening of one of my favorite shows, Are You Afraid of the Dark? We decided who was going to be it, then we all went to hide. It was dusty in the attic, and a few of us got found right away when we started sneezing. I expected that we might see the kid we had seen earlier, but there was never any sign of him. I didn't think much about it. Kids rarely question things that don't come from adults. And as we played, the volume of our game became louder and louder. We began to scream with joy every time someone was found, and some of them had taken to scaring each other instead of just playing hide and seek. I'm sure that some of the people from downstairs could hear us, but given that we were 2 floors up, we might have been mistaken for just regular noise. I was hiding behind a vanity near the back of the attic, peeking out from around the edge of the sheet, when I heard a little voice in my ear that scared the crap out of me. It scared me because up until then, I'd been the only person hiding behind the vanity. You guys shouldn't be here. You're gonna wake up Daddy, and he'll be mad." I turned around, and there he was. He was crouched down behind the vanity, looking at me with these big, sad, scared eyes. And now that I was closer, I could see he was dressed in suspenders and a grubby-looking white shirt. His feet were bare, and his hair looked like someone had cut it with a bowl. I asked him who he was, but he shook his head and put a finger to his lips as he made a shushing sound. "Shh. You're gonna wake up Daddy, and he's gonna be mad." I started to ask him who he was talking about, when all of a sudden, we heard loud footsteps coming up the stairs. Someone was yelling, but it wasn't regular yelling. Usually when my dad yelled, there were swear words in it or some kind of direction. This yelling was just babbling, like an angry beehive or a car when it needs an oil change. It was angry, and it was loud, but there really wasn't any substance to it. The game quieted down as we all became the hiders. We knew that we shouldn't be here. We all knew that if we were found, we'd be in trouble. So we all took to hiding as someone came very angrily up the ladder. I could see the others as they hunkered around the other covered piece of furniture and storage boxes. They all looked scared, but they also looked excited. This was a different level to the game, something a little scarier. We all knew that this was the real game, and we had to win, or we might never be allowed to come back again. Through the white, oiling up out of the square hole, came a large something. It was man-shaped, but maybe not a person. It had arms and legs. I could see a head, but the rest of it seemed to just be shadows. It was like someone standing in total darkness, and I think even then I suspected that this was no museum curator coming after noisy children. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up, and as the thing started looking for us, I turned and found the little boy was gone. The other kids seemed to have felt it too, and as the thing moved towards the left side of the attic, we all started shuffling to the right. It knocked over a box and kept yelling in that strange, barely coherent way. It didn't seem unfamiliar with the attic, and I wondered if it was up here looking for us, or if it was looking for the little boy who'd been a stranger to me. Either way, we made our way back to the ladder and started quietly going down onto the second floor. We were almost all down when the thing turned and looked at the 2 or 3 of us that were left. He didn't have eyes, at least none that I could see, but I felt very seen by it, and the last of us went down in a herky-jerky pile of bodies. We ran back to the staircase, and that's when someone else found us. We burst through the door that led out onto the stairwell, and almost knocked over a lady with a tour guide name badge. She blinked at us and did not seem at all happy to see 7 or 8 kids coming out of a restricted area. She asked what we thought we were doing in there, and we told her that we thought it was open. She said no, the door was always locked, and told us we better get out of there before we got in trouble. When she asked how many of us there were, that's when we seemed to disagree. Some of us said 7, but a few of us insisted that there were 8. No, there was only 7 of us. Remember, that's why we didn't play Capture the Flag. Yeah, but then the other kid joined us, so we had 8. What other kid? There was only ever 7 of us. The kid in the suspenders. He was playing in the attic with us. At that point, the lady was completely frazzled and collected up all of us and brought us downstairs to have a talk with our parents. In the meantime, she had a few of the other people search the second floor and the attic for a missing kid. Most of our parents were not terribly pleased about being drug away from the festivities because their kids couldn't behave, and we got an earful as we stood in the foyer of the Martin house. Some of us, me included, were more worried about the missing kid than getting into trouble. I can't speak for everyone, but I'd seen how scared he was. I don't know who he was afraid of, but I was afraid that whatever that thing had been, it had got him. As my dad let me have it for acting out, my eyes started to wander. I was looking at the pictures on the wall, the ones showing the Martin house through the years, before they finally settled on a very familiar face. The kid looked less scared and more confused, but it was definitely him, standing on the front lawn with 2 other kids and his parents. The house behind him looked a little different, but it was definitely the one we were standing in right now. Hey, that's him, I said, interrupting my dad in the middle of his lecture. Who's him? My dad asked, not appreciating being interrupted. That's the kid, the one I saw in the attic. The lady who had found us looked at the picture before shaking her head and telling me not to tell lies. No, really, I assured her. That's him. He was hiding with us. He told me that we were going to wake his daddy up. He looked really scared. My parents didn't believe me, but I've seen that picture since, and I know now that that little boy is one of the Martin brood. He was one of the kids who allegedly hung from the tree in the front yard, and I would have bet you anything that was his spirit we saw. The big shadowy thing didn't look at all like Mr. Martin, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. The kid didn't have black eyes like all the other stories tell, but maybe that's something that comes a little later. I've encountered a lot of strange things in my life, but that was one of my earliest scrapes with the paranormal. As of writing this, the Martin house still sits in the same spot. They've completely closed off the inside these days, and after that year, the hospital started doing their employee appreciation somewhere else. I don't know if it was the house itself, or because they got a better deal somewhere else, but I never went back to the Martin house again.
I didn't want the sweater in the first place. From the first time I laid eyes on the damn thing, I knew it would haunt me until the day I died. I first saw it in a thrift store window when I was 10 years old. It was a lumpy green thing made out of thick yarn, an ugly monstrosity that looked like someone's grandmother had knitted badly. As much as I hated it, I was also drawn to it. Even as I stared, I thought I could see a pair of big, goggly eyes in the pattern. 2 sharp teeth floating amongst the swirls of thread seemed eager to bite me as I slid it on. The arms ended in little tassels that looked like claws, sharp claws that looked like needles. I hated it, but I was drawn to it in that way that children are drawn to anything that might end their perceived immortality. Mom must have noticed my interest. 2 weeks later, just as the autumn chill began to rise, she gave it to me one morning so I could wear it to school. She pulled it out from behind her back, flourishing it like the end of some magic trick. She smiled hugely, clearly thinking she had something I really wanted. My stomach dropped when I saw it, and I was again filled with a sense of dread that she must have picked up on. "It's the sweater you liked so much," she said, looking a little hurt. "You really seemed taken with it when you saw it back at the store." "Mom, didn't have the money to buy me much. Dad had left when I was a baby, and she worked as a waitress to put food on the table and a roof over my head. We didn't have a lot of money for presents, and I could tell that however much this sweater had cost was too much for me to act anything but grateful. I pulled it on, not really wanting it on my skin, but pretending it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It was made out of scratchy wool that I just knew at first glance would make me feel too warm. It rubbed at my skin like steel wool as it settled on my arms. It just felt wrong as it sat against my smooth skin, and I immediately wanted to take it off. It felt like there were bugs in it. As I walked to the door, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe roaches or earwigs had gotten into the fabric. She walked me to the bus stop, all the while smiling at me as I pretended the sweater wasn't the worst thing I'd ever worn. As the bus pulled away from the curve, I yanked it off and stuffed it in my backpack. My friend Mark looked at me strangely. "New sweater?" "Mom found it for me, but it's just about the most uncomfortable sweater ever." "I thought it looked kinda cool," Mark said. "Like Slimer from the Ghostbusters." The movies were pretty popular around this time, and I had to admit that it did look pretty ghoulish. The pattern on the front, big teeth and bug eyes, did make it look a little like the green ghost from the movie, and we talked about it all the way to school. I forgot all about the sweater until I got home that afternoon. I found it crumpled at the bottom of my backpack when I got started on my homework. I took it out and laid it over my desk chair. As I sat to do my homework, though, it began to itch at me. I took it and tossed it in a chair by the closet door instead, getting back to work. Even having it against my skin made me feel weird, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at it as I did my homework. It felt like it was looking at me somehow, staring at me with those huge bug eyes, and I felt haunted by it as it sat placidly. When Mom came home a few hours later, she seemed happy to see the sweater. "I knew you would like it. Was it warm enough today?" "Yeah, it was just right," I lied. I finished my homework and went downstairs to help with dinner. Typically, I would have sat in my room or watched television till dinner was made, but tonight, I just wanted an excuse to be out of my room, away from the sweater. My room felt invaded every time I looked at it, and I just wanted to be anywhere but there for a few hours. I didn't think about it again until it was time for bed. I came into my room, pajama bottoms and a white undershirt on, with my mouth still feeling minty from the toothpaste. I was ready to climb into bed when I saw the sweater again. For some reason, I just couldn't stand looking at it anymore. I picked it up, the coarse fabric scritching at my hands, and tossed it under the bed. I knew it meant nothing, a meaningless gesture, but I didn't want it watching me while I slept. Mom came in and kissed my forehead. "Good night, honey," she said as she turned off the lights and closed the door. I burrowed down under the covers and started getting comfortably sleepy. It had been a long day, with another one to follow, and as I began to edge towards sleep, I started to hear a weird noise from somewhere in the room. It sounded like someone dragging wire across the hardwood, and as I focused my attention on it, I could hear the sound sliding across the boards. I sat in my bed and looked for it, that harsh slithering that wound its way over the flooring. As I cast my eyes over by the chair, I saw the source of the noise. It was the sweater. It was sitting on the chair where I had thrown it earlier, leering at me with its toothy grin. It couldn't be there. I had thrown it under the bed, but there it sat, as though I'd never grabbed it in the first place. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I hadn't thrown it. Maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing, and now I was just scaring myself. I rolled over and tried to get back to sleep. As I tossed and turned, though, I could almost feel those bug eyes looking at me. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it all out. As I lay there, I imagined I could hear that wire dragging across the wood again. It was like the scratching of claws times 10, and I could hear it going under my bed and towards the wall. I peeked out from under the covers and looked towards the chair, making sure that hideous sweater was still there and not responsible for the noises. The chair was empty, though. I sat straight up and peered around the semi-dark, searching for the sweater. It couldn't have moved. It was a sweater, a stupid sweater, and even my 10-year-old brain knew the sweater didn't just get up and move around on its own. I looked over the edge of the bed, seeing nothing, and hesitantly hung upside down so I could glance under the bed. In my 10-year-old brain, that was where the monsters lived, and this sweater had become a monster now. I peeked, afraid to see it, but it wasn't there. Only a few toys and some dirty clothes greeted me. I looked back at the chair, still finding it empty, and snuggled down under the covers so I could get some sleep. I awoke in the morning to a terrible pain in my arm. The sweater was in bed with me, curled around my arm as though it had gotten tangled on me in the night, and I wrenched it off violently. I didn't want it to touch me. I didn't want it to contact my skin. As I came free, I saw the source of the pain. On my forearm, on the inside of my arm, was what looked like a bite. As I inspected it in the dewy morning light, I felt sure I could pick out individual teeth marks on the flesh of my arm. I looked frantically at the crumpled green garment in the corner and suddenly felt sure that it was the source of the bite. I ran downstairs to show my mom, who was just starting to get breakfast things together. She looked at the bite and declared it a rash. "Probably from your new sweater," she said, and I could hear real sadness in her voice. She still believed that I really liked that ghastly thing, and the thought that it had caused me pain made her sad. She said she would wash it today after school and have it back to me by tomorrow, and I remember hoping that it shrank in the wash. I thought all day about the terrible garment coming back too small or shredded by some fluke, and the idea brought me some little amount of joy throughout the day. When I got home, however, I heard the washing machine in full swing and found a note on the table saying that Mom had gone to get groceries. I figured she put the sweater in with the load and went upstairs to start my homework. Mark and Davey wanted to ride bikes later, and I knew that if I got my math done before dinner, I'd be able to go riding with them before the sun went down. When I opened the door, I was startled by the green sweater sitting on the chair where I had left it last night. I was angry at myself for a moment. Why was I so afraid of this stupid sweater? I grabbed it up, yarn digging into my hands like steel wool, and took it to the laundry room. I opened the washer and threw it inside, slamming the lid closed and stomping back upstairs to start my homework. I finished quickly, and when Mom got home, I went outside to play. I spent the afternoon riding bikes and jumping dirt ramps with my friends, and as the streetlights came on, I turned for home. When it came time for bed, I walked back up to my room to find the sweater back on the chair where it had been earlier. There was a stack of freshly folded clothes on my dresser, but for some reason, Mom had put the sweater back on the chair. I walked around the sweater as I got ready for bed, but I kept thinking I could see it move out of the corner of my eye. It didn't leave the chair, but I thought I saw the arms wiggle or the waistband shiver slightly as I walked around the room. I went straight to bed after lights out, and in the morning, I found more bites on my arm. 3 new bites, to be exact, each one on the underside of my arm, not on the outer arm where everyone might notice them easily, and each one looking much the same as the first. The sweater wasn't in bed with me this time, but I knew it had been the one to do it. Mom still thought it was a rash, but I was convinced that they were bites. For the next few weeks, I tried various measures to keep the sweater away from me. I left it in other rooms, sometimes with the door locked, but it always found its way back to my room. The closet was no obstacle at all for it, and twice I awoke to see it sitting in the chair as the door slowly closed behind it. One night, I stuffed it in the washing machine and closed the door locking behind it, and I still woke up the next morning to find it in my bed. My sleep started to suffer, and I found it hard to get a full night's sleep as I woke up to search for the sweater. My teacher told my mother that my performance was suffering, and I was given DRs several times for sleeping in class. If they'd seen what was under my sleeves, they would have probably had some questions for my mother, too. The bites were numerous, red and oozing blood sometimes. I kept them closely guarded, because if my teacher found out, I felt like my mother could be in big trouble. I kept them from both my teacher and my mother, not wanting her to ask questions either, and as it went on, our relationship became strained. She knew I wasn't sleeping well, but she wouldn't even entertain the idea that it was due to some evil sweater. She thought I was looking for attention, that I was just a typical child with an overactive imagination, but she couldn't take off work just to sit at home with me and protect me from a piece of clothing. At one point, she even threw the sweater in the garbage, thinking that would solve everything, but when it reappeared in my bedroom, she accused me of keeping it around to get attention. After 2 weeks of being terrorized, I decided to finally put a stop to it. That night, I stayed awake and watched it. The next day was Saturday, and I knew Mom wouldn't care if I slept in. I was going to catch it in the act and show Mom that it was hurting me. Maybe then she would let me get rid of it. I had a big metal flashlight with a thick blanket I was going to catch it in. I would hold on to it until it ran out of steam, and then show my mom so she wouldn't think I was dreaming. I watched the red numbers on my Ninja Turtles alarm clock tick slowly by, and by 11:30, I was having trouble staying awake. The sweater hadn't done anything but sit there all night, and as my eyes got heavier and heavier, I found myself slipping towards sleep. I lost the fight before midnight and woke up with my head against the blanket. I looked at the clock and saw that the numbers read 2:45 a.m. I swept the light around the chair and tried to orient myself. The beam fell on an empty chair and I couldn't help but feel dread mounting. Where had it gone? Had it slipped off the chair while I was asleep? As I searched for it in the beam of light, though, I heard a familiar sound of wire scraping against the wood behind me. I turned the beam onto my headboard, and there was the sweater. I thought for a moment that I might be dreaming, but as the flashlight illuminated it, I had to come to grips with the idea that what I was seeing was very real. The bug-eyed pattern had become a real set of bulbous eyes. The green body was a voluminous mass of fibers and filaments, and the teeth had become large and snapping. It was perched on my headboard, clearly startled by the sudden intrusion of light. It emitted a loud, otherworldly scream as it leapt at my face, and I swung the flashlight without thinking. It smacked into it with a soft woof sound, and I watched it fall to the floor next to the closet. The beam fell on it again, and it scrambled across the floor as it frantically crawled for the bed. I sat on the bed and listened as it rustled beneath the box spring. I had glimpsed its true form now. I had seen the wicked teeth that had left marks on my arm, and I was not about to let it sink them into me again. I jumped out of bed, flipping on the lights, and scooped up the sweater as I headed down the hall. The hall closet was stuffed with old tubs for storage. As I wrenched open the door, I found what I was looking for on the second shelf. Mom had an old popcorn tin, the kind you give people for Christmas when you're not sure what else to give them. As I reached for it, I felt the sweater shriek and scramble towards me. It knew what I meant to do, and it knew that it would be stuck if I did. I grabbed it before it could latch onto me and stuffed it down into the metal guts of the tin. I was going to trap it in here for good, a good long time, and there wasn't a thing that it could do about it. In the light, it was just an ordinary sweater. I made use of this knowledge and stuffed it into the tin. I heard it thrashing around in the tin and held the lid closed as I looked around for duct tape or something else to keep the lid closed. A few layers of tape over the lid and I felt confident that it wouldn't be able to escape. I stacked a few boxes on top of it for good measure and left it thrashing at the bottom of the closet. As I went to sleep, I could still hear it beating feebly at its prison walls. The noise was like a lullaby for my tired soul. I'd like to say that this is the end of the ordeal, but this story is actually my reason for writing it all. It's been 25 years since that night, and I had all but forgotten about it. I had put it off as the overactive imagination of a child, just like my mother had, until I came home from work today. After college, I moved several states away, taking a job as an architect for a big firm in Chicago. That's where I met Emily, and now we have a child of our own, my daughter Carrie. My mother loves her granddaughter, and comes to see her whenever she can, but most of the time, my mother's presence is felt through her packages. Cookies, toys, anything to make my daughter smile. And when I got home today, I found one of those packages open on the kitchen table. The box was empty, but there was a note inside addressed to Carrie. "Hi, Carrie. Grandma was cleaning out the attic and found something she thought you might like. It was your dad's when he was your age, and he used to make up all sorts of strange stories about it. It looked so lonely when I found it. I thought you might have more use for it than me in the Windy City. Love you, Grandma." As I looked at the note, my blood ran cold. What had my mother found tucked away in the attic? I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, catching sight of my daughter as she lay on the living room floor. She was coloring something in her binder, using her crayons to fill in whatever picture she had just drawn. At that moment, though, my focus was on the familiar green sweater she was wearing. The yarn was a little faded, but the bug eyes still stared at me, and the teeth smiled with that delirious mirth. As I stared, it seemed to say, "Hello, old friend. Thought you'd gotten rid of me, huh? But here I am. Time for our game to start again." Carrie turned around and smiled at me, springing up and wrapping her arms around me in a big hug. I had to stop myself from shuddering as the sweater touched me, and she stepped back a little so I could see when she was done. She did a little twirl so I could take in the whole thing, and it didn't seem to repulse her the way it had always repulsed me. "Isn't it great, Daddy? Grandma sent me this cool new sweater. I love it. It's so soft, and it's so warm." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded dumbly and walked back into the kitchen to fix myself a drink. After the second drink, I began to calm down a little, and I started writing this after my hands stopped shaking.
I don't have a clue what to do. How do you tell your daughter that she's wearing something that tormented you for 2 weeks? How do you convey to her that something she loves is evil? What do I do when the bites start appearing? How do I rid myself once and for all of this evil sweater?
When I was a kid, I had a pretty typical suburban childhood. White picket fences, ticky-tacky suburban houses, endless concrete for my friends and I to ride our bikes on, and the only strangers we saw were the occasional drifters or travelers that wandered through our town. My dad worked at the steel mill. My mom was a homemaker. I remember afternoons off from school filled with bike rides and trips to the arcade, Boy Scout meetings, and exploring Stokes Woods that lay just off the secluded neighborhood we all lived in. Stokes Woods was where my friends and I had so many firsts. It was honestly the first bit of real freedom we had. We spent summer days exploring, making maps and setting up camps that would be found later to our great amusement. It was our first brush with death, too, finding birds or animal carcasses on the trail. We poked at them with sticks and oohed at the bugs that crawled out. We never guessed that one day we might share their fate. I was in the woods the first time I swore, yelling, "Damn it!" as I skinned my knee when I was 8. I was in those woods the first time I saw a naked lady, the glossy pages of Terry's dad's Playboy gripped in my sweaty hand as we sat around the campfire when we were 11. It hosted my first camping trip. It was the first place I was allowed to camp alone. Well, with Terry and Reggie, but it was our first time out alone at night. It was also where we found the treehouse. The treehouse was a relic of kids gone by. It was in a big old tree set into a clearing, a fire pit dug in its shadow. It had a dumbwaiter to pull things up, and a rope ladder to climb up through a trapdoor. It was built in pieces. There was a wall inside with the signatures of kids who had added to it, complete with dates when they had completed them. When we came across it one afternoon, our 9-year-old eyes grew big with wonder. We knew we had found something special that day. Over the next few weeks, we replaced the rope ladder, cleaned out the fire pit, and replaced the dumbwaiter rope. We painted it too, finding some paint at the junkyard and painting the faded treasure in a wash of purple and brown and gold. We added a bike rack, again with the wood from the junkyard, and signed our names and dates on the wall when the project was done. The easy trip to and from the junkyard made me believe that the treehouse might have been constructed from the things they found there. We asked Old Man Macy, the caretaker, and he said that kids had been coming and going from the dump for years. He said every few years some kids would come along and take wood and pipes and things for special projects they did out in the woods. He was honestly glad they had been putting it to good use. We'd been playing and camping and using the treehouse for a couple of years when Terry suggested a Halloween sleepover. "It's on a Friday. We can camp out in the treehouse and eat candy and tell scary stories." I thought it sounded like a great idea, and my parents agreed. 3 kids alone in the woods may seem weird to some of you, but the town we lived in was pretty rural. Our town had a population of about 1,200, and crime was almost non-existent. Besides the odd traveler that sometimes blew through, you knew your neighbors pretty well. We had camped in the woods for the last 2 years, and the Boy Scouts had taught all of us how to camp safely and not burn down the woods. That night, we all hit the street as soon as the lamps came on. We set out with our pillowcases in hand and embarked on a sweet journey to collect the most candy. As always, we had a theme, and we were all dressed as the Avengers when we went out trick-or-treating. I was Hawkeye, bow slung over my shoulder, handmade costume and cheap mask covering my eyes. Reggie was the Hulk, body painted green and absurd rubber hands over his real ones. Terry was Captain America, his store-bought costume topped off by a trash can lid that he had painted a star on. We moved from house to house, striking poses and delighting adults as they filled our pillowcases with candy. By the time the porch lights started going out, we had bulging sacks ready to burst from all the candy we'd gotten. We stopped at our homes, dropping off a little excess candy and getting our camping stuff. We told our parents where we were going, and my mom kissed me goodnight and told me to come straight home if there was an emergency. And with that, we set off. We walked the familiar trails into the woods. Our backpacks were bulging with our candy sacks, and the night was lit by a full and ghostly moon. Terry and Reggie talked excitedly about the candy, wanting to tell ghost stories as we ate it. But I kept getting distracted. I could swear there was a noise out in the woods, a bird or a high-pitched wind. As we moved towards the treehouse, it seemed to follow us. The other two were oblivious, but the sounds made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It came closer and closer, never quite reaching us, but seeming to pass us sometimes. I heard it behind us, heard it in front of us, and how the others could remain oblivious of it was beyond me. When the treehouse rose up to greet us, it was a real relief. In the light of the full moon, though, it looked ghostly and strange. I had thought the noise would cease to be an issue once we arrived, but it only seemed to get worse. As we loaded our bags on the dumbwaiter, I could swear the whistling still surrounded us. I rushed them a little, gaining some grumpy looks, but I wanted to be out of the woods and into the safety of the treehouse. Once we were safe inside, lanterns on and candy spilled on the floor, I began to feel at ease. This was our sanctuary. Nothing bad could happen to us here. We were children who had yet to experience loss or any real trauma. We were secure in our knowledge that our parents would still protect us from anything, no matter how bad it got. We were foolish, but children are supposed to be foolish, I guess. Reggie was halfway through one of his full-size candy bars the Hudsons had been passing out when Terry suggested we start the ghost stories. Terry loved scary stories, and he usually had a pretty good collection of them from the internet or wherever. Reggie pulled a beanbag chair over from the corner, and I dragged a camp chair over so I could join the group of lanterns. Typically, we would tell our stories around the fire pit, but I think we all sensed that tonight it would be better to be inside. Halloween was unique somehow. It was best to be inside after dark. Terry brought the flashlight up under his chin, tilting the light knob down on the lantern and grinning at us ghoulishly. "This is a true story. I swear it on my life," he said, before beginning his story. He told us a story about a kid plagued by the ghost of a hobo that he and his friends had accidentally killed. They had been playing a trick on him, and he had choked to death on a sandwich. After he died, the boy kept seeing him around, in windows or on street corners, but his friends hadn't believed him. Then, while the boys were at a sleepover, the ghost struck. I found myself distracted as he told the story, though. The wind blew against our treehouse, creaking it in the branches of the old tree. But beneath the wind, there was a weird sound. That same whistling was coming from outside, a high-pitched keening that was not altogether tuneless. As I listened to it, it almost seemed to move through the surrounding trees as Terry wove his tale. Terry came to the end of his story, and the boy's friends died badly. The boy escaped the sleepover and ran for his home. The ghostly hobo dogged his heels, screaming his name as he chased him through the quiet streets. But the boy had made it home and slammed the door in his rotting face. He had leaned against it, safe at last, but as the banging began, he remembered one important fact. His parents were gone, Terry said, grinning in the flashlight beam. He might have made it home, but he was still at the mercy of the ghostly apparition. Terry told us how the door had bowed inward, the ragged hands pushing the wood like wax paper, but I felt my attention dragged away again. I could still hear the whistling, closer now, and I could swear there was another noise too. Rustling leaves maybe, or leaves crackling underfoot. Was someone outside the treehouse? And as Patches pushed at his door, trying to catch him, the boy snuck out the window and disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Terry seemed to notice then that I wasn't really paying attention. "Oh, come on, that was a great story." "Huh?" I asked. Oh yeah, something was just distracting me outside." Reggie looked quizzically at me. What was it?" "I thought I heard someone outside moving around in the leaves." Terry turned to look at the bare window, and Reggie walked over to look out into the inky blackness. The moon cast an odd light over his face, but as he scanned the ground, it gave away no sudden surprise. He shrugged his already broad shoulders and returned to his beanbag chair. He reached for a candy bar and started unwrapping the silvery foil. "Nothing there," he said after Terry and I stared at him for a second. "Must have been the wind." Terry had begun another story about a shadowy creature that lived in a stairwell. As he laid out the narrative, though, I could hear the whistling again. It wormed into my consciousness, spinning through the trees outside like a drunken bird. I could hear the leaves crunching again, the wind making them rustle like skeletal wind chimes. And suddenly, I too wanted to go to the window and look out into the night. I was trying to listen to Terry's story, but the more I tried to pay attention to it, the more I heard the noises from below. Terry looked miffed when I interrupted his story to drag up the rope ladder. I latched the hatch and came back to find him with his arms crossed and an indignant look on his face. "Think you can do a better story? Well then, hotshot, have at it." He tossed the flashlight at me, and I caught it by reflex. I thought about it for a minute and realized I did have a story I could tell. Maybe by getting it out, I could alleviate the fear that had been consuming me. I was ruining my Halloween campout, and for what? Some noise outside the treehouse? It was probably just a raccoon or something that we had spooked when we arrived. My unease had given me the perfect story, though. So, these 3 kids were walking in the woods. They were going camping, and were going to a familiar spot in the woods to set up. They left their homes at dusk, wanting to camp out under the stars in just their sleeping bags. Their parents told them that if anything went wrong, they could come home and sleep there. But the boys had done this 100 times, and felt that they knew the woods like the back of their hand. They felt like nothing in the woods could surprise them. But they were wrong. Terry sneered, but he sat close to the lantern and listened nonetheless. Reggie opened another candy bar, the story drawing him in as the stories almost always did. Reggie didn't really seem to like scary things. He was kind of a fraidy cat. But he liked stories. He would sit and listen, getting more and more terrified, but always beg for another when you were done. They walked towards the determined campsite, talking animatedly about the s'mores they would make and the scary stories they would tell. One of them kept hearing something as they walked. He could hear a snap of a twig, the crunch of a leaf, and it made him wary. He told his friends, but they shrugged it off as nothing. It was late afternoon, the sun was setting, and the animals were coming out to forage. They were probably just hearing animals moving around in the dry leaves. The 2 of them went back to walking, talking between themselves, but the third kept listening, kept looking over his shoulder to see what lay behind. Terry and Reggie were paying attention, Terry a little begrudgingly. Reggie's eyes were large and starey as he listened. As I told the story, I almost thought I could hear the leaves crackling outside, the wind in the trees rattling the dying year's foliage against the limbs, and a low whistle could be heard outside. It was tuneless and wafting as it warbled across my sanity. I knew just what was stalking these kids through the woods as I began to spin their tale. He kept asking them to listen, telling them it was important, but they wouldn't listen to him. They kept walking, kept talking, and all the while the crunching leaves and the rustling of limbs followed them, getting closer and closer. The boy became afraid. The steps sounded large, but he couldn't see anything in the trees as they proceeded down the trail. One of the others finally yelled at him, telling him to stop being stupid and just enjoy the trip. There was nothing out there. No one but he could hear it. He was being dumb. He needed to relax. I paused for dramatic effect, seeing Terry roll his eyes at the description of the boy in the story. That's when they heard the whistling. And I imagined I could still hear the whistling outside the treehouse. It was getting closer and closer as I told the story. Was the story drawing it in? Was I calling it to the treehouse? But by now, though, I couldn't stop myself. The story needed to be told, and I had become a conduit for it. I would tell it to the end, even if the whistler came right up the tree after us. They all froze when they heard the whistling. This was no wind through the boughs of a tree. This was a tuneless, monotonous whistling that cut across the dying afternoon like a sickle through wheat. It was behind them, seemingly on the trail, and they could hear it getting closer and closer. They began to make their way towards the campsite, walking a little faster, but all 3 looked over their shoulder now. They were all made uneasy by the whistling, and they all wanted to put some distance between themselves and it. My friend sat forward, hanging on my every word, entranced by this new development. Outside, I imagined I could hear the whistling coming from just outside the clearing. They didn't talk anymore. They didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They let their feet take them ever onward, but the whistling followed them. The friends who had insisted it was nothing said that maybe they should speed up a little bit. The campsite couldn't be far. Once they were there, they could take a side trail and get back to town. Or whatever it was might leave and they could get back to their campout. The other two agreed, but all of them knew that the campout was already canceled. None of them would sleep here tonight, not willingly. They sped up, but the whistling followed them steadily. One of them said that they should stop and confront the whistler. He must be human. Who else could whistle? The other two shot him down, though. The whistling was discordant, jangling against their nerves, sounding like nothing they had ever heard before. Both agreed that they didn't want to find out what whistled like that, and they kept moving. Something bumped the bottom of the tree, but my audience didn't seem to notice. It wasn't a hard bump. It didn't shiver the whole tree. It felt more like an inquisitive tap, a gentle knock, someone trying to get our attention. I put it out of my mind, maybe the wind or something, and kept telling my story. They kept moving, deeper and deeper into the woods, all the time being chased by the whistling. They broke into a run, the campsite still not coming into view, and still the whistling grew closer and louder. The whistling took on a life of its own, rising and falling in its chaotic tune as it became less and less discernible. The children put their hands over their ears, the noise scraping against their mind like a rusty scalpel. The hands would not block out the whistling, though. They heard it inside their heads as it battered their senses, and when the first one tripped, the other two did not stop to help him. They didn't hear his screams, but they felt a change when the whistling thing got him. A night bird called out from the forest, but now the whistling was in my own head, and I only registered it as something different. I told the story frantically, hoping it would stop the whistling in my head somehow. They dropped their packs and ran. They sprinted, flat out, knowing that the trail must be up ahead. They would round the bend, and there it would be. It would be there, as it always had been, and they would cut back towards town. It never occurred to them that the creature could just cut through the forest after them. The trail to town had a talismanic effect on them. If they could make it, then they could walk it, and then they would be safe. They ran, they wept, but the whistling followed them on and on, their feet crunching against the leaves and pine needles, sounding like gunfire, but they hardly noticed over the eerie whistling in their heads. My two friends were leaning close now, the lantern making their faces look like jack-o'-lanterns as their eyes begged for the climax. And still, that whistling assaulted me, threatening to drive me mad. If they noticed it, they gave no indication. When the second boy fell, the first never noticed. He ran and ran, trying to outdistance the whistling, trying to get it out of his head, and when his friend was found, the whistling again took on a different note. The lone boy ran and ran, hoping to outdistance the crazed whistling, knowing that his fate would be the same as his friends if it caught him. Some say he runs to this very day. Some say the whistling got him in the end. No one knows for sure. I heard the whistling abate a little. It didn't leave, but it did lighten slightly. I felt like crying as I came to the end of my story. Maybe I would be allowed to live where the boys had died. The search parties found their backpacks 2 days later, animals having worried at them to get at the food that was inside. They found the campsite bare, no fire having been lit in weeks. Of the boys, they found no sign. No trace was ever found. Not a scrap of clothes, not a footprint. They were never seen again, but the children in the area say that you can hear the whistling in the woods on quiet nights. On those nights, it's best to stay indoors. The whistling takes all who venture too close, and the whistling will haunt you for the rest of your life, however long that may be. That was when the whistling stopped. It stopped so abruptly that I wondered if it had ever been there at all. For a 10-year-old to question his mental stability was a strange feeling, but at that moment, I was just glad it had passed me by. The other two shook off their rapture, looking as though they had been hypnotized, and Terry blew out a long breath. Well, damn, that was a good story. I can't top that. And suddenly I'm feeling kind of tired. Yeah, Reggie said dreamily. Me too. Think maybe we should go to bed. I would have argued with them on most nights, but tonight I was as drained as the rest. We laid out our sleeping bags and burrowed down, dropping off quickly without the usual chatter that preceded it. I'd like to tell you that that's where the story ends. I wish I could, but that wouldn't be doing justice to the memory of my friends. I awoke in the wee hours of the morning when someone threw a pillow at me. It was not thrown playfully. The throw was hard, angry, and directed at my face. I sat up, rubbing my cheek, and became aware of the keening whistle that had returned. It was louder than ever, and it chilled me to the bone. For God's sake, stop it, Terry yelled, staring daggers at me. Your story was good. We all said so, but trying to scare us with that stupid whistling isn't funny. I heard someone crying and looked over to see Reggie in the corner with his hands against his face. The whistling was loud and discordant, just as I had described it in my story, and it appeared that I wasn't the only one that could hear it now. Terry looked madder than I had ever seen him, and Reggie was clearly terrified after the story I had spun. It's not me, I swear, I told them. Terry glanced at me for a few seconds before realizing that I was right. He had woken me up. How could I be the whistler? He moved to the window and I joined him, trying to see the source of the whistling. Most nights we would have nothing to see but the inky blackness, but under the light of the full moon, the yard was shadowy but visible. As we scanned the yard, we could see little. The fire pit below, the logs we sat at as we toasted our marshmallows and wieners, the woodpile we had tarped against the rain. I had almost decided to go check the other window when Terry gasped like a stepped-on cat. I looked and saw a man in a long cloak step out of the tree line. He was dressed in a dark gray coat, long and flowing like a trench coat, and a tall cowboy hat, making him look almost 7 feet tall as it poked towards the sky. The toes of his pointy boots poked from beneath the coat, and I thought they looked battered and scuffed even from here. The wind seemed loath to touch him, but by the way he pulled the cloak around him, you'd have thought he was freezing. I could see a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight as they looked up at us, and decided that he must be wearing glasses. Of him, we could see very little under the cloak, but he made us uneasy. The whistling seemed to be coming from beneath the cloak, and when it stopped, he began to speak, and I wished for the whistling again. His voice was raspy, pinched, croaksome, a dead man's pleading last words. It's so cold, boys. Might I take shelter in your treehouse for the night? I shuddered, not knowing what to say. Somehow, though, Terry found his voice. Go away. Our mother told us not to talk to strangers, and we don't know you. Please, boys, kind boys. Didn't your mother teach you hospitality? Let an old man in out of the cold, he pleaded. No, Terry said, and moved away from the window as though the man might somehow leap through it. The man didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just sat on the log beneath our tree and continued to whistle. The jagged cords wafted up into the treehouse, and I saw Terry shudder. He picked up a boot that had been part of my costume and went to the window to throw it at the man. Terry sent it sailing, but hissed when it didn't connect. He threw several other things at the whistler, but the old man never seemed to be where he was aiming. Terry cussed loudly, reaching for the lamp. I wrapped my arm around it, begging him not to. It's all the light we have, Terry. Please. He tore it out of my hand, growling as it came free. He chucked it at the old man, the heavy plastic thing not even getting close to the target. It broke on the ground, shattering and fizzling with an electric pop. The inside of the treehouse was darker for its passing, the three of us now sitting in near darkness. The whistling went on, though. The man never seemed to run out of breath, and the shrill noise took its toll on all of us. Reggie began to rock in the corner, sobbing loudly as the man whistled and whistled below. Terry screamed at him from the window, his rage never ending, as I covered my ears and tried to keep the threads of my sanity together. It seemed to last for hours, for days, and as I sat with my eyes closed, I prayed it would end. When I heard the floorboards creak, I opened my eyes. It was Reggie standing by the window, his foot already on the ledge. "Reggie? What are you doing?" I breathed, half getting up. Reggie looked back at me, snot runners creeping down his face. His naked face looked tortured, tears cutting lines down his dirty cheeks, still streaked with green. He smiled gruesomely at me as he framed himself in the window, and I didn't have to ask what he intended to do. I tried to stop him. I pulled myself up from the floor to go to him, but it was already too late. I just wanted to stop," he breathed, before throwing himself out the window. We never heard him hit the ground over the loud and terrible whistling. Terry stormed over to the hatch and had it unlatched before I could throw myself across it. "What are you doing?" "What do you think I'm doing? I'm gonna go do something about this guy." "He's an adult, Terry. You can't do anything to him." "Get out of my way. I'm going out there." "He's scary, Terry. You shouldn't go out there. You'll end up like Reggie. Terry kicked me, sending waves of pain through my guts, and I rolled off the trap door. I heard him throw it open and toss the ladder down, descending in a shriek of rage as he made his way towards the Whistler. As scared as it had made Reggie, the Whistler had made Terry a furious juggernaut. I drew myself up, my ribs hurting as I hobbled to the trap door. I looked down before closing it and gasped in horror against my throbbing chest. The man was at the bottom of the ladder. His face was still hidden by the coat, his eyes a glistening twosome amidst the swirling dark void, and I could see thick red fluid around the collar of that cloak. He was 2 rungs up the ladder, temporarily frozen by my gaze, and I slammed the hatch and threw the lock a second before he slammed into it. I crawled away from the hatch, seeing it buck wildly and hearing him scream at me to open it. He cussed and howled like an angry animal, wanting to get in, but stopped by the strong bolt that some past child had installed on the sturdy hatch. Maybe they had installed it to keep him out, I thought. My fear overtopped me at some point as I watched the door jump in its frame, and I must have passed out. When the banging woke me up, it was daylight, and I screamed loud enough to startle whoever was banging. "Easy, kid. It's Sheriff Blasky. Are you okay?" I dragged myself to the hatch, my ribs aching, and threw the bolt before falling back, panting. If it was the Whistler, I hoped he was quick at least. My ribs would turn out to be broken, and their healing would encompass 2 of the worst months of my life. Every time I breathed in, I was reminded of the Whistler and that last encounter with Terry. At that moment, though, I didn't care what happened. I just wanted it to end. Sheriff Blasky pushed the flap open, though, and I guessed I'd get to live another day. He took me to the hospital. He took me into the waiting arms of my parents, who pulled me into their warm embrace and threatened to never let me go. I'd been missing for 2 days, they told me, and when the police had seen the state of our treehouse, they feared the worst. They never found any sign of Terry or Reggie. I told them what had happened. I told them about the whistling man, about Reggie's fall, and Terry charging him from the treehouse. I told them about how I'd locked the trap door and passed out as I watched the man trying to batter his way in. They took my statement, searched those woods with officers and dogs and every able-bodied set of legs they could find in town, but they never found anything. Not a scrap of cloth, not a drop of blood. My friends were just gone. That was 8 years ago. I've seen that night in my dreams every night since. The events live on in my memories, and I often wake up screaming as the man tries to break that hatch open. In my dreams, I don't pass out. In my dreams, the hatch doesn't hold. In my dreams, I wake up as he wraps his hands around my throat and drags me towards that pitch-black maw he hides behind his coat. I haven't been back in the forest since that day. I don't think I ever will. Lately, though, I've been hearing the whistling as I lay in bed at night. I look out the window, my backyard butting up to the woods, and see 2 small figures hovering on the outskirts. Sometimes the man in the coat is there too, but I know better than to try to tell my parents. They're gone when they get there, and I just end up looking crazy. I leave for college next week, and I've chosen one in the middle of a big city. I plan to attend it because the closest collection of more than 4 trees is 60 miles from my dorm. I'm hoping that distance will stop this apparition, but I just don't know. I can hear the whistling now, even as I write this. I can hear my dead friend's soft call as they entice me to come out to play. I can hear that whistling as it scrapes across my nerves yet again. I hear it, and I hope that I get to leave for college before it becomes too much for me to bear. I'm not proud of it, but when you receive one of those calls about your car's extended warranty, it's sometimes me. I'm a writer, a published writer, with an agent, a bestseller, and everything. 5 years ago, I was number 3 on several bestseller lists. 5 years ago, Oprah featured my book on her book list. 5 years ago, I sat on Ellen DeGeneres and promoted the crap out of my book, a move that netted me the house I now live in. It was a good year for me, and when my agent suggested that I write a sequel, I jumped at the chance. 5 years later, my sequel is finally coming together. But the bills don't stop just because your royalties and your residuals stop rolling in. My wife went back to her job at the grocery store, something to help pay the bills while I was working on my book. But it just wasn't enough. We had lived a little too grandly for the last 4 years, and now the money was gone. I told her I was paying the bills out of the residuals, but in reality, it was the salary I made working call center jobs like this one. Call center jobs are pretty easy, all things considered. You read a script, you call gullible people and offer them goods and services. You rake in little bonuses when you manage to trick the old or the infirm. It also allows me to work from home so I can proofread pages and research chapters while I cold call people in my pajamas. You get a lot of hate, a lot of people playing games, but that kind of thing is easy to ignore. Hell, I did retail for 8 years when I was young, and it's given me a pretty thick skin. It was easy to ignore when you realized that whether you made the sale or not, you were still going to receive a check at the end of the week. It was a pretty good gig, until I cold called someone I shouldn't have. The voice that picked up the phone was deep, cultured, and I should have known that it wasn't a voice of someone that could be fooled with such a cheap trick. He was the last number on my sheet for the day, and I figured I had nothing to lose. Yes, Sara, I'm calling you about your car's extended warranty. Do you still own the 2013 Link? Does this ever actually work? I stumbled for a moment, choosing to roll on with the script rather than break character. Lincoln, the warranty is nearing its expiration, and we're offering select customers this is the 5th call I've received from your company today, young man. I started to ignore it, like I'd ignored the others, but I figured I'd pick up this time and see what was so important. I see now that the answer was nothing. I tried to stay in character, but it was hard in the face of his frank honesty. Look, I'm just doing my job, sir. I've got bills to pay and a family to feed, same as you. If you aren't interested, then Oh, a family man! Is that why you take the elderly for their pensions and scam the mentally handicapped for their hard-earned money? Such a provider. I'm sure your children would be proud of their father. He said it in such a matter-of-fact way that I almost didn't register it as an insult. I could have hung up on him. He wasn't the worst offender I'd had all day. But something about his voice rankled me. Where did this guy get off? He was going to sit here and tell me how rotten it was to make my money this way, like I didn't already know? Where the heck did he get off? Look, buddy, there's no reason for any of that. We're just calling to let you know about your warranty program. If you don't want it, then I'll just... He cut me off again. Don't worry about it, friend. I'm sure you'll have more prevalent things to worry about soon enough. Ciao. The line went dead then, and the silence seemed ominous. I sat the phone down like I thought it might blow up. I'd been threatened on the phone before, but this one felt different. There'd been no screaming, no cursing, no invitations to screw myself, or questions about how I slept at night. I shuddered a little, suddenly feeling like a goose had walked over my grave. I jumped a little when I saw my son standing in the doorway, scratching his neck. Michael had wandered into my office while I was on the phone. I turned to him as he stood scratching, his hand moving up and down his back, before asking if he was okay. He'd been napping, something he would have to give up when he started school next year, and it seemed that his itchy back had woken him slightly ahead of schedule. "Daddy, my back is so itchy." I told him to go lay in bed while I grabbed the cream and the lotion. His mother and I called it Triceratops cream, something that always made Michael laugh, and it seemed to be the only thing that helped with his eczema when it got really bad. It's something he's suffered with since he was very young. We've had to wash his clothes with dye-free detergent, use special soap during his baths, and stay far away from things like wool. So I grabbed the cream and the lotion so I could lather him up and bring his itching to an end. As I slid his shirt off, however, I worried there might be something else going on here. Michael's back was covered in boils. A swath of small pustules with white heads were scattered over his pink skin, and they looked like pimples. There were clusters of small patches, islands of blight on a sea of normal skin, and I was honestly a little afraid to touch them. Nevertheless, I mixed the cream together and rubbed them onto his back, feeling him jump as some of the boils burst beneath my fingers. He seemed to relax when I finished, thanking me as he slid his shirt down gingerly. That was how it started. I wish I could say that was where it ended. I was proofing pages when my daughter, Michelle, arrived home from school. She stumbled into my office, her hands scratching at the back of her neck absent-mindedly, as she hugged me and told me about her day. We'd done this ever since her first day of school, and it was one of her daily rituals. She'd taken a test she believed she'd done well on, found $1 in the storm grate near the house, and told Jenny that she was being mean to Sara, so the two were no longer friends. I listened to her in a detached way, nodding and mm-hmming as she talked, noticing her scratching her neck a couple of times. The scratching didn't seem peculiar. People scratch sometimes, but I couldn't help but notice the red patch of skin on the back of her neck as she left to go start her homework. I turned back to my work, but sighed as I noticed the time. I saved my work and locked my computer. I had hardly gotten through half the chapter I was working on, but it was time to get started on dinner before my wife got home. The pork chops were cooking in the air fryer when my wife came through the door. I smiled as I turned to pull her against me, kissing the top of her head as she leaned warmly into me. She shuddered a little as my hands touched her back, but said it was just some back pain from standing all day. Mary called out again, so I was the only one working the register. Again. It was 8 straight hours of standing behind the register, listening to people complain. "How'd your book proofing go today?" I turned away from her, pretending to stir the potatoes as I answered. Stephanie could always tell when I was lying. Pretty good. Lots of progress. I'm sure it'll be ready for my agent in a few weeks." "That's fantastic, dear. I'm sure it will be as much of a hit as your last one," she said, pressing a kiss on my stubbly cheek. I smiled, but I really wasn't so sure. It all came down to this latest book, it seemed. I just had to finish my book. I just had to write another hit. I just had to find my way back onto the bestseller list and get myself out of Dutch. Easy, right? The next morning, I awoke determined to get some work done today. I would make up for my lack of work the day before and end with some real progress. I still had over 200 pages to proof, and if I didn't get them done fairly quickly, there would be no time to send them off, and quite likely I'd have to sit through notes on a second draft. As I went to wake my daughter up for school, however, I heard the hoarse cough coming from my son's room. I cracked the door to find him lying on his stomach, his shirt off and his back worse than the day before. His skin was broken out in red, angry boils, and the small white-headed blemishes of the day before had become larger and redder, their tips filled with translucent pus. He was softly moaning, his eyes begging for me to make the pain stop as they pulsated. My wife came out of the bedroom then, getting ready for work, and saw Michael's back. She ran to him, careful not to touch any of the spots, and asked me if he'd had these since yesterday. "He was broken out," I said honestly, startled by the sudden appearance of the large angry boils, "but it wasn't this bad. I put on lotion and cream, and he seemed to feel a lot better." Stephanie started talking quietly to herself, mostly arguing with herself about whether she could find someone to cover for her. But I told her I could take Michael to the pediatrician. Heck, what was the point of being a stay-at-home husband if I couldn't take my son to the doctor? She asked if I was sure. She knew I had work to do today, but I told her that it was nothing. I told her to go to work and that I would handle things here. I told Michael to stay in bed, not wanting him to aggravate any of the blisters he had on his back, and went to go wake Michelle up so she didn't miss her bus. I was in for another surprise when I got to her room. I opened her door and was immediately buffeted by the sound of her racking cough and her low groans from the bed. She was warm to the touch, not overly so, but definitely fevered, and I asked how she was feeling. She said it felt like she had the flu. Her throat hurt, she was hot, and her whole body ached. My wife was getting ready by then, stepping into the shower before she stepped into her uniform, and I figured it would be just as easy to make an appointment for 2 kids as it would for 1. I told Michelle to get some clothes on, and that I would make an appointment for her and Michael. With all the COVID paranoia still floating around, it was pretty easy to get an appointment last minute with the symptoms they were presenting. 1 phone call to an after-hours nurse later, and I prepared to trade all my editing and proofreading time before work for time spent sitting in the car until it was our turn to go to the back. It was an hour and a half before we made it in, and I tried to make the most of it by doing some edits on my phone. It was slow and tedious, the 2 of them glued to their phones or their gadgets in the back seat as they hacked and coughed, but I managed to get a little bit of work done before they sent me a text saying they were ready for us in the back. 30 minutes later, their pediatrician came back with very little by way of an explanation. Well, they don't have COVID, or the flu, or anything else that I can test for here. What they do have is a high fever, a very wet cough, and troubling boils all over their back. Michelle too, I asked, having not been aware that she was sporting boils as well. Michelle too, she confirmed. Her outbreak isn't as bad as Michael's, but it's getting worse. I'd recommend that you keep them at home until it clears up. Don't touch the sores with your bare hands, and if you happen to by accident, be sure to disinfect your hands with alcohol. Wear gloves and a mask when you interact with them, and go to the hospital if you or your wife start presenting symptoms. I'm hoping it clears up on its own, but if it doesn't in a day or 2, you should take them to the hospital anyway. I bundled them back into the car, a handful of prescriptions in my pocket, and called my wife as I went about getting their medications and getting them home. All of this, the meds, the visit, everything, was going to cost some, and I needed to get them settled so I could log some hours at work. My wife's insurance wasn't very good, and the money I made would be crucial if I wanted to get out of debt. I also had to find some time to work on my book, knowing in the back of my mind that it was the secret to solving my current problems. Stephanie picked up on the 3rd ring, and the cough she rumbled into the phone sounded suspiciously like the ones from the back seat. She swore it was just allergies, and commiserated with me about the diagnosis. She wished she could be there, but said that she would likely be late this evening. Mary had called out, again, and she was the only one working register today. It was noon before I got everyone medicated, set up in their rooms with lunch and toys and entertainment, and sat down at my computer so I could begin my day. As I took calls and proofed pages, I felt a little bubble of anxiety every time someone picked up the phone. I was still a little rattled by yesterday's call, but all of my calls today seemed normal enough. I actually had 2 people give me their information and buy one of the garbage warranties we offered. I had no idea whether they worked or not, but the company was paying me to make calls, not research their products. In between calls, I peeked in on the kids to make sure they were okay. Michael spent most of the day sleeping, his breath heavy and wet, and Michelle just looked at me whenever I peeked in on her, seeming listless and barely there. I gave them more meds and made sure they had juice and liquids, and kept an eye on their temperatures as I took calls in between my nursing duties. As the sun set, I began to get worried about my wife. She should have been home by now. Should have been home a half an hour ago. And I was just about to call her when I heard the door pop loudly open. She was laid out on the floor of the living room, her coughs deep and wet, her own blemishes peeking from the collar of her work shirt. I took them all to the hospital then, just bundled them into the car and went. The ER didn't know what to make of them, but we've all been quarantined upstairs now as I try to figure out why I haven't gotten sick with the same symptoms as the rest of my family. They are working hard to manage their fevers. All 3 of them are around 103, and they're laid out on their stomachs as their boils have become very fragile. They're afraid that popping them might lead to sepsis, but the longer I look at them, the more intrigued by them I become. I've been sitting in the room for the last few hours, my only company the beeping of their machines, and as I sat next to my wife, I noticed something strange. The boils on her back seemed to be forming a pattern, the swoops almost looking like a picture. I sat stroking her hand, Stephanie groaning in and out of consciousness, and the longer I looked, the more I realized the swoops are words. Moving over to Michael, I can see he has similar words, all picked out in the pustulant boils that mark his baby-fine skin. I brought my phone out and snapped pictures of their backs. the three of them requiring a little turning and moving before the messages were visible. I'm sitting here now as I contemplate telling the doctor what I've found. I don't think it'll help, but I don't know what to make of it either. It can't be what I believe it is, but I can't think of any other explanation for the words that I'm reading swirled across the painful backs of my family. The message reads, "I've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty."